Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening, both in person in our auditorium at St. Thomas More College and online. My name is Tammy March. I'm a faculty member in the psychology department at STM, and I'm currently serving as STM's dean. I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement that is included in the University of Saskatchewan's new policy entitled Indigenous Truth, which was approved by their Board of Governors this past July. The intent of the policy is to protect Indigenous truth and space for everyone, truth to self, truth to each other, truth to ancestors, and truth to the land. The land is acknowledged as our mother, the earth. The University of Saskatchewan, along with St. Thomas More College, is committed to honor and support the Indigenous peoples, Indigenous cultures, Indigenous values, and Indigenous languages that belong to the land of Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. The university, along with STM, is committed to working towards honoring and supporting colonized lands and protecting the land in a way that demonstrates respect and love. We extend this commitment to the lands and treaty territories, that's treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 10, that constitute Saskatchewan and all Indigenous peoples that call Saskatchewan home. We are born to the land, and the land claims us. Welcome everyone to the first public event of the Islam, Peace, and Justice Conference. And it is truly a perfect day for the start of this conference, given that September 21st is the International Day of Peace, which is a special day established in 1981 by a unanimous United Nations General Assembly resolution. Peace Day provides a globally shared date for all humanity to commit to peace above all differences and to contribute to building a culture of peace. 2 decades later, in 2001, the General Assembly unanimously voted to designate the day as a day devoted to commemorating and strengthening the ideals of peace, both within and among all nations and peoples. This year is particularly significant as it is the 20th anniversary of that 2001 UN resolution, with the theme this year being End Racism, Build Peace, which coincides so nicely with the theme of this conference. This conference has been long in the making, having been delayed for 2 years or more because of the pandemic. So it is truly wonderful to have you all here this evening. And thank you to the members of the Planning Committee for all their work organizing this conference and bringing the conference to a reality. So thanks to Dr. Heidi Epstein, Dr. Fakrasal Holm is here, Dr. Chris Horenko in the front row, and Dr. Gertrude Rompre here as well. The conference is a result of a partnership between the Islamic Association of Saskatchewan, the Saskatoon Peace Coalition, and the Department of Religion and Culture at STM, and the Irene and Doug Schmeiser Center for Faith, Reason, Peace, and Justice, which is also housed here at the college. The conference brings together scholars from around the world and from a multitude of disciplines to discuss the intersections of Islamic traditions, peace building, and social justice. The goal of the conference is to challenge worn-out stereotypes about Muslims and the all-too-common connection between Islam and violent extremism. In the place of these stereotypes, it is the hope of the conference organizers and the participants to illustrate how Islam and Muslims have, do, and can draw on faith-inspired principles to foster cultures of peace and justice. We had 2 wonderful online sessions earlier today, one on historical and sociocultural context, and the other entitled Contested Issues, War, Peace, and Justice. There will be 2 online sessions tomorrow, the first entitled Common Narratives, Peace Education, and Environmental Issues, and the second, Peace Building in Contemporary Practice, as well as a second keynote address at 5, followed by a synthesis panel and prayer. So 2 very informative days, and I just wish my schedule allowed me to take it all in. I'm very pleased to be here this evening to hear our first keynote speaker, who I had the pleasure of dining with just the past couple hours and getting to meet. I'm going to now ask Dr. Alicia Parmesan to come forward to introduce the keynote speaker and the lecture for this evening. Thank you, everyone, and happy Peace Day.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Asma Assaruddin tonight for you. Dr. Assaruddin is class of 1950 Herman B. Wells Endowed Professor and professor of Middle Eastern languages and cultures in the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University. She is also an adjunct professor in the departments of religious studies and gender studies. She is the author or editor of 8 books, including the award-winning Striving in the Path of God, Jihad, and Martyrdom in Islamic Thought, as well as her most recent book, Jihad, What Everyone Needs to Know. She has also published over 80 articles and essays in both scholarly and popular venues on various aspects of Islamic thought. Professor Afsaruddin is currently a member of the Academic Council of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University and is a past member of the Board of Directors of the American Academy of Religion. She was previously the Kramer Middle East Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the College of William and Mary, and a visiting scholar at the Center for Islamic Studies at the London School of Oriental and African Studies. She frequently lectures in the United States, Europe, Middle East, and Southeast Asia, and has served as a consultant to the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life and the United States Institute of Peace. She has won major research grants from the Harry Falk Guggenheim Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And in 2019, she was inducted into the Johns Hopkins Society of Scholars in recognition of the scholarly and professional distinction she has achieved in her field. So thank you for joining us tonight. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Assaruddin to the podium.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Hoping everyone can hear me? Yes? Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace on this very important day of peace. Let me begin by thanking, first of all, Professor Chris Harenko, whose last name I just learned to pronounce. And I know my last name presents problems for a lot of people, so I'm very conscious about that. But I definitely want to thank Chris and all his colleagues at St. Thomas More College for extending this very kind invitation to me to come to Saskatoon and take part in the events of this evening and for these 2 days. This is my very first time here, and everything I've seen so far, both at the university and in the larger community, has impressed me very much. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your schedules to come and participate in this event as well. So let me begin my talk today by emphasizing that the concept of peace is a central one in Islamic thought and tradition. This may come as a surprise to some of you, given the predominantly negative and violent image of Islam and Muslims that we find in the Western media and on the internet. But the very root of the name Islam has connotations of peace and safety and soundness. Related to the word Islam is the Arabic word salam, whose basic meaning is peace. As-salam is one of the 99 names of God in Arabic, uttered by pious Muslims everywhere. It is also well known that Muslims traditionally greet one another by saying Assalamu alaikum, which I just uttered, which means peace be on you. And the response to that is wa alaikum assalam, and may peace be on you as well. The frequent invocation of the term salam underscores the importance of the concept of peace in Islamic religious thought and praxis. With regard to the general establishment of peace as a socio-organizational principle, the prevalent attitude among Muslims is that the revealed laws of God, properly interpreted and implemented, will inevitably lead to the ultimate desired objective of a just and peaceful social order. Let me now go on to a fuller discussion of peace in the Quran. The Quran, as you know, is the central revealed scripture within Islam and believed by Muslims to be the very words of God. Peace is idealized within the Quran as a state that governs the life of the faithful and defines their relationship with the Creator and His creation. Within the Quranic worldview, peace is the ultimate objective, the achievement of which provides the most noble and loftiest purpose for human striving and existence on earth. The very revelation of the Quran is associated with the concept of peace. The 97th chapter in the Quran, known as the Night of Power, Laylatul Qadr, describes the first occurrence of the Quranic revelation as follows. By the way, you should have picked up a handout already, and so that should help you follow along. I'm going to be warning you, throw out quite a few Arabic terms at you, which will not be familiar, I imagine, to many of you. So now I'm quoting an English translation from the Quran of this chapter, the Night of Power. We have indeed revealed this message in the Night of Power. And what will cause you to be aware of what the Night of Power is? The Night of Power is better than 1,000 months, during which the angels and the Spirit come down by their Lord's permission regarding every matter. Peace. This is so until the break of dawn. End of quote. Embrace of Islam is equated with entering into a peaceful state. Quran 2:108, chapter 2, verse 108, addresses the believers in this way. O you who believe, enter into peace wholeheartedly. The Arabic word used for peace here is as-silm, which is related to as-salam. According to the famous late 9th century commentator on the Quran, whose name was At-Tabari, he died in 923 of the Common Era, as-silm specifically means peace and peacemaking and refers to a peaceful disposition. The Quran describes entering into Islam as entering into the abode of peace, Dar es-Salam. In chapter 10, verse 25, the Quran states, God summons to the abode of peace. He guides whom He pleases to a way that is straight. End of quote. Accordingly, the speech of righteous believers must be grounded in peace. At a minimum, they should call for peace upon one another. Even better, that they should try to outdo one another in exchanging greetings of peace. In chapter 4, verse 86, the Quran commands, and when you're greeted with a greeting, greet in return with one better than it, or at least return it in a like manner. Indeed, God takes account of everything. End of quote. One should not churlishly refuse to respond to another's peaceful greeting. The Quran in chapter 4, verse 94 admonishes, do not say to anyone who offers you peace, you're not a believer. Muslims may invoke peace even on those who harass them for their beliefs and cause them mental anguish. In chapter 25, verse 63, the Quran praises, and here I'm now quoting from the Quran, the servants of the All-Merciful who walk humbly on earth, and when the foolish jeer at them, they reply, peace. Peace follows the righteous into the next world. When they're admitted into paradise, the Quran in chapter 50, verse 34 says, they will be greeted by angels who say, enter in peace. That is the day of eternity. The believers will hear no offensive speech in paradise, nor any mention of sin, but rather only the saying, peace, peace. This is referenced in chapter 56, verses 25 to 26 in the Quran. And in chapter 36, verses 54 to 56, the Quran says, after the resurrection, the dwellers in the garden on that day will delight in their situation. They and their spouses will recline on couches in the shade. They will have fruit and whatever they call for. Peace, the word will reach them from a compassionate Lord. End of quote. By the way, I have not necessarily given you all the verses and translations. I've only selectively done that. Peace in the Quran is not just the absence of violence and conflict, which has been called by some a negative peace. It is rather a holistic concept that is based on two key factors. First, the recognition of the equal dignity of every human being as God's creation. And second, the guarantee of justice for all on earth. These two key factors allow for peace to be conceptualized as resting on a fundamental restructuring of socioeconomic relations and interpersonal relations that are conducive to establishing and nurturing a just and egalitarian society. Such a society can achieve what many today call positive peace. That is to say, a lasting and enduring peace because it addresses the root causes of violence and conflict, which are inequality and injustice, and thereby seeks to transform society by uprooting them. With regard to the first of the two key factors of positive peace, the Quran in chapter 17, verse 70 declares, "Indeed, we have honored every human being, and that every human being has been shaped in the best of shapes." And this is from Quran 95, chapter 95, verse 4. These verses establish the intrinsic dignity and equal worth of all human beings, regardless of gender, ethnicity, race, and social status, by virtue of being human. With regard to the second factor, injustice, a number of Quranic verses establish the necessity of justice as a characteristic of the ideal human society. This is, for example, evident in Quran 57:25, which states, "We sent before our messengers with clear signs and sent down with them the book and the balance of right and wrong, so that humans may stand forth in justice." End of quote. Furthermore, Quran 4:135 states, "O you who believe, stand firmly for justice as witnesses before God, even if that be against yourselves, your parents, your kin, and whether it be against the rich and poor." While another highly significant verse, from chapter 5, verse 8, states, "Let not the hatred of others cause you to incline to wrongdoing and depart from justice. Be just, for it is next to piety." These verses clearly establish that justice, according to the Quran, is not only an important component of peace, but an indispensable one that allows for human flourishing on earth. After the Quran, the Hadith literature that contains the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad is the most important source of law and ethics. Like the Quran, the Hadith literature emphasizes the concepts of nonviolence, peace, and cordiality in relation to the daily life of the pious Muslim. In the best-known collection of Hadith, known as Sahih al-Bukhari, generally revered by Sunni Muslims as the most authoritative source after the Quran, the Prophet is quoted as uttering the golden rule, as related by the famous companion Anas ibn Malik. Now, companion is the name we give to the close associates and followers of the Prophet Muhammad who lived during his own time. According to this famous companion, the Prophet said, "No one among you is a believer until they love for others what they love for themselves." And that should sound familiar, right? The golden rule that I think finds reflection in practically every major world religious tradition that I can think of. The compiler of this Hadith collection, the famous Hadith scholar al-Bukhari, who died in 870, lists another significant statement in which it is stated that the Prophet had commanded Muslims to habitually visit the sick, attend funerals, quench the thirst of people, come to the aid of the weak, help the oppressed, and spread peace among people. According to another hadith, a man asked the Prophet, "Which Islam is best?" And the Prophet replied, "The offering of food to the hungry and giving greetings of peace to those you know and to those you do not know." The second best-known hadith collection is by another well-known scholar, Muslim ibn Hajjaj, who was a contemporary of al-Bukhari, died in 875. And this collection contains numerous reports that attest to the importance of safeguarding peace and cultivating kindness as characteristics of sincere believers in God. A much-cited hadith is attributed to Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, in which she relates that her husband had addressed her and said, O Aisha, God is most gentle, a rafiq in Arabic, and he loves gentleness. Thus he grants to gentleness what he does not grant to harshness or violence in Arabic, al-unf. The Prophet also counseled his followers, do not bear rancor or envy towards one another, and do not oppose one another. Be servants of God and brothers of one another. It is not lawful for a Muslim to abandon his brother for more than 3 nights. As in the Quran, a number of hadiths stress the importance of justice as a corollary to peace and social stability. In one such hadith, the Prophet is quoted as saying, whoever deals justly with people has carried out an act of charity. In one particularly notable hadith, the Prophet reported that God himself had declared that he had made tyranny and oppression unlawful for himself, and that he had therefore commanded humans not to oppress one another. Many other hadiths make the case for peace, nonviolence, gentleness, and just behavior to be practiced by the faithful and to urge others towards it, of which I've just presented a brief but important selection. The concept of peace raises questions about how to establish peace and nurture it when human nature tends to incline towards conflict and strife. So we may ask here, what advice does the Quran provide for bringing about reconciliation between erstwhile or potential adversaries, particularly within the Muslim community? And even more broadly, what kind of protocol does it establish for creating enduring peace among all people of goodwill, especially with members of the 2 other Abrahamic faith communities? Let me turn to a discussion of this point next. There are a number of verses in the Quran that address the matter of establishing peaceful interpersonal and communal relations. These verses stress the importance of the cultivation of fraternal bonds among fellow believers and the creation of genuine reconciliation between erstwhile enemies. The centrality of harmonious relationships and the importance of maintaining peaceful relations among believers is articulated very clearly in chapter 49, verse 10 of the Quran. And this verse states, the believers are brothers, so make peace between your 2 brothers and be mindful of God so that you may be given mercy, end of quote. The next 2 verses, chapter 49, verses 11 through 12, stress that believers should be mutually respectful and courteous in their speech and not engage in critical and malicious gossip about one another. Such socially destructive behavior stirs up resentment and ill will and undermines the bonds of fraternity and cordiality that should characterize relations among believers. I'm now going to briefly look at specific verses and their interpretations by selected commentators that highlight the importance of the concept of peace in Islamic scripture and tradition, and especially in the context of social relationships. These verses are often cited in dialogic contexts with members of the 2 other Abrahamic faiths, as well as in the context of intra-Muslim conversations. The first verse I want to discuss is Quran 8:63, chapter 8, verse 63, which states, and this should be on your handout, and he has joined or reconciled their hearts. If you had spent all that is in the earth, you could not have joined their hearts, but God has united them. Indeed, he's almighty, all-wise, end of quote. The famous medieval commentators on the Quran, like At-Tabari, Al-Qurtubi, and Ibn Kathir, understand this verse to be a reference to the Aus and Khazraj tribes in pre-Islamic Medina, who bitterly feuded among themselves and often went to fierce battle against one another. The verse refers to the healing of their bitter past and mutual forgiveness after they became believers, as well as to the strong bonds of love that were created more broadly between the Meccan emigrants and the Medinan helpers in the post-Hijra period. The Meccan emigrants are those Meccan Muslims who emigrated from Mecca to Medina in the year 622 of the Common Era. And the Medinan helpers are those Muslims in Medina who helped the emigrants in their dire hour of need. Many of them had left all their worldly possessions behind. And I think I give you the Arabic names for these two groups on your handout. I'm not going to repeat them, but they're there for you if you should need to refer to that. The emigration from Mecca to Medina that was undertaken by the Prophet Muhammad and his followers in 622 is known in Arabic as the Hijra. And this event marks the beginning of the Islamic era, the Hijri calendar. In this context, Quran 863 is understood by At-Tabari to stress that only when God enters our hearts can this kind of transformation occur. At-Tabari comments that this verse addresses the Prophet and reminds him, quote now from At-Tabari, "Were you to spend, O Muhammad, all that is on earth of gold, money, and worldly goods, you would not be able to reconcile their hearts with all your strength, for it is God who joins them in guidance." End of quote. At-Tabari references an earlier Medinan exegete by the name of Mujahid ibn Jabr. He died very early, died in 720, early 8th century, who in connection with this verse related that once he met a man in Medina. His name was Abda ibn Abi Lubaba, a name that you don't have to remember. But Mujahid took the man's hand in his own and said, quote, "If you should see two individuals who harbor love for God, one of them takes the hand of the other and smiles at him, their sins drop off them just as the leaves drop from the tree." End of quote. This statement conveys Mujahid's conviction that sincere faith in God results in genuine bonds of friendship and goodwill among believers, expressed outwardly in gestures of friendship towards one another, such as by shaking hands and exchanging smiles. But simply going through such motions does not automatically create an atmosphere of affection and friendship, unless they're firmly embedded in faith and love for God. This latter being a much harder task and can only be brought about by God Himself. Once firmly implanted in one's heart, love for God translates into love for one's fellow beings. In the late 19th century, much closer to our time, the famous modern Egyptian exegete Muhammad Abdu understands this verse to apply primarily to the Meccan Muslims who became brothers of the Medinan Muslims in faith, despite differences in social status and worldly rank. And you have to realize that this was actually a radical act in a very tribal society that recognized the value of human beings based on their membership within specific tribes. So members of powerful tribes had a higher standing in Meccan society. Members of lower tribes did not have very much of a standing in Meccan society at that time. Abdu underscores this dramatic transformation in the following way, and I now quote directly from Abdu. "As for the Meccan emigrants, reconciliation, the term for it in Arabic is ta'alif, literally joining of the hearts. Reconciliation occurred among the rich and the poor, their masters and their clients, their nobility and their common people, in spite of the arrogance of the Jahiliyyah, which is the name given to the pre-Islamic period, in spite of the arrogance of the Jahiliyyah that had previously existed among them. It was this concord among them that allowed them to endure the enmity of their fellow tribesmen and relatives for the sake of God. None of this could have been achieved by means of all the wealth and enticements of the world." End of quote. Abdu then goes on to point out the centrality of love in human relationships, which has been, he says, asserted by wise people through the ages. "These sages agree," says Abdu, "love is the greatest of all bonds among humans, and the most potent inducement to happiness is human social life and its refinement." End of quote. They further concur, Abdu says, that in the absence of love, nothing else can take its place in repelling evil, while the proper functioning of society is contingent on the dispensation of justice. While love has been considered to be instinctual and not a matter of choice, and justice regarded as an act of deliberation, Islam made love a virtue and adherence to justice an obligatory duty. Abdu stresses that justice in particular was the due of all who reside in Muslim lands, with no distinction to be made between the Muslim and non-Muslim, pious and impious, rich and poor, etc. In this important exegesis, Abdu goes further than his pre-modern predecessors and extends the concept of reconciliation based on love and justice to all human beings, regardless of their religious affiliation or lack thereof. He argues that out of love for the Creator and adherence to justice, the individual and the state must treat everyone even-handedly. Let me now go on to a discussion of two other important verses that stress reconciliation and peaceful coexistence among people as well. These verses state, "Repel evil with what is better. Then the one between whom and yourself enmity prevails will become like your friend. But none achieves it meaning this state of affairs, except for those who are patient and of great fortune." End of quote. In the late 8th century, the well-known Quran commentator Muqatil ibn Sulaiman discusses the occasion of revelation for this verse. By the occasion of revelation, I'm referring to the larger historical context for a verse in the Quran. Oftentimes, a verse will have a back history, so that helps us understand the original context and connotation of that particular verse. So Muqatil is saying that these verses refer to the prominent Meccan Abu Lahab, who was the uncle of the Prophet. Abu Lahab has become infamous within the Islamic tradition for having severely persecuted Muhammad, his nephew, and his followers when he began to publicly preach the message of Islam. So much so that the Prophet came to harbor a strong dislike for his tormentor. In chapter 14, verse 34, the Quran counseled him to forgive and pardon Abu Lahab so that his enemy may become transformed into a close friend and ally. The next verse, 41:35, states that only those who show forbearance by suppressing their anger may attain to these good deeds. Here, good deeds are glossed as forgiveness and clemency. Al-afu wa safh in Arabic. And only they will attain to the bounteous blessings of paradise, continues Muqatil, our commentator. God had thus urged the Prophet to be patient and practice forbearance in the face of injury, even severe injury from his enemies. The famous commentator At-Tabari, whom I already referred to, understands Quran 41:34 to contain a more general command for the Prophet to treat his enemies gently and to disarm those who wish him harm through forgiveness and forbearance. Furthermore, this verse is also understood to command all believers to be forbearing when provoked to anger and practice generosity and forgiveness in the face of injury. When they do so, At-Tabari says, God protects them from the wrongdoing of others, and their enemies relent and become transformed into close friends. Others understand this verse to command Muslims to respond with greetings of peace, as-salam, to those who cause them injury. As for the next verse, At-Tabari continues, it affirms that only those who show considerable forbearance in the face of wrongdoing and tribulations are able to ward off evil with goodness. The 12th century exegete, Az-Zamakhshari, illustrates the difference between what is good, in Arabic it's hasana, and what is better, ahsan, by offering concrete examples of what constitutes that which is better in the face of wrongdoing. At dinner, we were talking about how I was intent on not letting anyone leave this room without having learned at least a little bit of Arabic. And if you hold on to your handout, you can retain the memory of some of these words. But the words that are so similar, hasan and ahsan, are actually different in some important ways, which Az-Zamakhshari goes to great lengths to explain. So he says, an act of goodness, hasana, is to forgive the wrongdoer. But to carry out that which is better, ahsan, is to respond with an act of goodness or charity to specifically counter or wipe out the original injury, and thus to go beyond simple forgiveness. Thus, as Zamakhshari advises, if an adversary were to revile you, praise him. If you were to kill your son, then ransom his son from the hands of the enemy. If you were to carry this out, your inveterate enemy will become transformed into a sincere friend, full of goodwill towards you. Only the people of forbearance and patience attain to this and reap goodness as a result, he stresses. He realizes this is a tall order, right? We'd have to really fight against our inner inclinations to immediately retaliate, but he says, this is what the fully formed moral individual should be called upon to do. In the late 12th century, another well-known Quran commentator by the name of Ar-Razi says that the phrase repel with that which is better commands the Prophet to ward off the ignorance and foolishness of the ignorant people by the best means, by unflaggingly bearing with patience their evil nature, not reacting in anger to their insults and provocation, and by refraining from physical retaliation in return for their injury. It is possible that they will thereby become ashamed of their reprehensible behavior and abandon their repugnant acts, and their feelings of hatred will become transformed into affection and goodwill. Ar-Razi goes on to say that only those who are patient and forbearing in the face of trials and tribulations, those who suppress their anger and forego retaliation, will attain to the great blessings promised in this verse. This survey of important exegetes from the pre-modern period and their interpretations of these critical verses clearly established that peacemaking and reconciliation are highly important concepts in the Quran. Peacemaking and reconciliation can be carried out most effectively by those who are indeed patient. And this involves restraining one's anger, showing magnanimity in the face of ignorance, and forgiveness of the harm that others do to you. Such people achieve abundance of happiness in this world and the next, and are able to convert their enemy into a bosom friend, he assures us. Let me now go on to a discussion of human dignity, a concept that is foundational to the Islamic worldview, as it is to the other Abrahamic religions. And when we talk about human dignity within Islam, we must talk about the rights that inhere in the individual by virtue of being human and the best of God's creation. Medieval Muslim jurists came to hold that 5 essential rights were guaranteed by Islamic law to all human beings, not just Muslims, by virtue of being human. The first is the right to life. Every person has the right to protect his or her life. No harm should befall an individual unless he or she willfully takes a person's life or represents a threat to the security and well-being of other people. And this is referenced in chapter 5, verse 32 of the Quran. Right to protection of property. An individual's ownership of property and control over their belongings needs to be respected. A person's property cannot be confiscated without legally valid reasons. Right to practice one's religion. In addition to protection of life and property, Islam protects the individual's right to practice one's religion free of coercion and interference by others. Right to protection of one's intellect. This sounds rather awkward in English translation. I played around with various translations and I thought, just explain what it is. It's very hard to translate otherwise. But this concept points to, and especially in our modern context, in our modern understanding, is essentially that people should enjoy freedom of conscience and freedom of expression to the extent that such freedoms do not encroach on the rights of others. And finally, the right to protection of lineage and honor. People have the right to have families and procreate. No person has the right to violate the honor and integrity of another person through slander and innuendo. Now, the jurists wrote extensively on these rights, and so there is a voluminous literature out there that one can consult when writing about these essential 5 rights. But the concept of these 5 rights became deeply entrenched in Islamic law and ethics, and you find it repeated frequently in both juridical works and theological works and ethical works as well. Rights, of course, have to be coupled with duties and responsibilities. As social beings, we have particular responsibilities to fulfill in regard to our fellow human beings, our loved ones, and to strangers. There's a strong emphasis within the Islamic tradition on social ethics, as in many other religious traditions. Fazlur Rahman, the well-known scholar of Islam in the modern period, has remarked that personal piety and righteousness, embodied in the Arabic term taqwa, are best realized in a social context. In other words, a personal belief in God and love for Him must, of necessity, also become translated into moral and ethical behavior towards all creation, which ensures mutual respect and peaceful coexistence. Such moral and ethical behavior should be expressed in the following ways. First, fostering proper familial and communal relations. Respect for the inherent dignity and sanctity of the human person is the basis for social interactions. Islam emphasizes the importance of community and communal life for the individual. Moral and ordered communal life is necessary for the proper flourishing of the human individual and society and to promote the common good. High on the list of an individual's moral and social responsibilities is therefore the preservation of family ties and of kinship in general, on which the Quran lays great emphasis. In the Islamic vision of social life, the family is the basic unit of society within which women and men are assigned mutually complementary roles. Men are entrusted with financial support and maintenance of the family. Women are entrusted with the rearing of children and the well-being of the family. And you can find references to this in Quran 2, chapter 2, verse 233. Obedience to parents. Those of you who are parents in the audience will find this very pleasing to their ears. Obedience to parents and showing respect and kindness towards them are also emphasized in the Quran. The Quran counsels the believers to show particular compassion for parents when they are old, and not to speak even a single word of reproach to them. Muslims are instructed to leave a portion of their wealth to parents if they should outlive them, as well as to other relatives. This is described as an obligation on the God-fearing. One cannot sever ties of kinship even when one is hurt by one's relatives. The Quran rather commands the believer to forgive and to continue to support them, as in chapter 22, verse 24, which states, "Let not those who are wealthy refrain from giving charity to relatives and to the poor and to those who emigrate for the sake of God, but let them pardon and forgive. Do you not wish that God should forgive you? And God is all forgiving, all compassionate." There are also several hadith statements of the Prophet which exhort Muslims to be particularly concerned about their neighbors and their welfare, regardless of their religion. This concern for our neighbors can take many forms. It means to ensure that our neighbors have the basic necessities of life. In one well-known hadith, the Prophet declares that one whose neighbor goes to bed hungry at night is not a believer. Being neighborly means that Muslims should wish for their neighbors what they wish for themselves. It means sharing with them not only food and other worldly provisions as need be, but also sharing in their happiness and sorrow. Furthermore, it means not to spy on them, and to respect their privacy, not to gossip about them, and to refrain from speaking ill of others. This might even mean to keep areas of common use, such as apartment building entrances, streets, and sidewalks, clean and accessible for all. The old, the very young, and the sick are entitled to our special attention and care. There are many hadiths which urge believers to show respect for the elderly and affection towards children. Muslims are urged to visit the sick and spend time with them. With regard to business ethics, fairness in commercial transactions is prescribed. Usually, the charging of interest at an exorbitant rate is forbidden. Above all, believers are urged to deal with one another kindly, honestly, and patiently at all times, and to give each other good counsel, and to confer with one another in matters of mutual concern. According to the Quranic vision, our charity and neighborliness extends to all human beings, regardless of their religious affiliation. Humans are to come to the aid of one another, whether they be Christians, Jews, Muslims, or of other religious affiliations, and they are to work with one another in enjoining what is right and good and preventing what is wrong. This is a basic moral and ethical principle in Islam, and I will be coming back to this shortly and talk a little bit more about the importance of this concept. The second point I want to make is that moral and ethical behavior also includes acting as responsible stewards or custodians of the earth. The Quran states that humans were appointed as God's vicegerents or representatives on earth. It's a very important verse from chapter 2, verses 28 through 29, which say, "And when your Lord said to the angels, 'I'm setting on earth a vicegerent,' they said, 'What? Will you set therein one who will do corruption there and shed blood, while we proclaim your praise and call you holy?' He said," God says, "Assuredly, I know what you know not." And God taught Adam the names, all of them. End of quote. What is the significance of these verses? It means that humans out of all creation enjoy a unique relationship with God, for God gave us knowledge that no other creature possesses. As God's representatives in this world, humans are bound to implement the divine law known in Arabic as the Sharia on earth. And this view is at the root of Islamic ethics. Closely connected with the human stewardship on earth, and this stewardship is actually known as khilafa in Arabic, is the notion of trust. An Arabic word that's very important, amana, which you don't have to remember at all, but it translates into the notion of trust. What does that mean? The earth has been given by God to human stewards as a trust, meaning that they're obligated to live on it, cultivate it, and take care of it as God had intended them to do. Such a trust would translate into concern for environmental justice and for economic justice for all. Our trusteeship of the earth means we should be concerned with whether everyone has equal access to the earth's resources or not. This is also a part of charity. According to a statement of the Prophet Muhammad, and here I'm quoting again, "The earth is green and beautiful, and God has appointed you his stewards over it. The whole earth has been created a place of worship, pure and clean. Whoever plants a tree and diligently looks after it until it matures and bears fruit is rewarded. If a Muslim plants a tree or sows a field, and humans and beasts and birds eat from it, all of that is counted as charity on his part." End of quote. Even in times of war, Islamic law orders that trees, crops, other vegetation, and animals are to be given the same protection accorded to civilians in all places of worship during armed conflict, all of which would be necessary tools for the eventual restoration of peace. This concern for the environment drives home the message that our salvation is linked to the well-being of our fellow humans and to the well-being of all living beings, including animals and plants. A lack of concern for the well-being of others, that is for the common good, points to moral and spiritual bankruptcy within ourselves, regardless of how careful we are in observing certain rituals and how diligent we are in personal worship. The common good in Islamic thought, in Islamic ethical thought in particular, is termed in Arabic maslaha. It's also important, by the way, in legal thought. Maslaha is an Arabic word which means benefit or utility. The promotion of the common good became an important objective in Islamic law, since the interpretation of the foundational religious, moral, and legal principles and precepts within Islam, collectively known as the Sharia, must be guided by considerations of public welfare and benefit. As historical circumstances change, this very important legal principle of maslaha, of the common good, allows, at least in theory, for new appropriate interpretations of the Sharia to emerge, which advance the well-being of people. In order to promote the general welfare of society, which is part of our role as stewards of the earth, Islamic teachings emphasize a foundational moral imperative to command and support what is good and to forbid and prevent the doing of wrong. When the forces of evil threaten to overcome the forces of good, one must resist by a variety of means. One hadith says that the believer must strive to resist wrong by the heart, the tongue, and the hand, allowing for different modes of resistance to wrongdoing. But the message is clear. Injustices and wrongs must be resisted and corrected. Otherwise, one would violate God's order on earth and be guilty of a serious abdication of moral responsibility. Justice tempered by mercy is a moral desideratum in Islamic thought. Justice and mercy are, in fact, two qualities most associated with the essence of Islam, the essence of what it means to be a Muslim, and the essence of an Islamic society or community, according to many Muslim scholars. These two qualities are constantly emphasized throughout the Quran. All the chapters in the Quran, except one, begin with the same phrase, "In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate." God's justice, which is part of his infinite mercy, receives equal emphasis. Among the 99 names in Arabic that describe God's attributes is the Just One. The cultivation of these two attributes, justice and mercy, is also incumbent upon humans as God's representatives on earth. In exacting justice, the law of equal retaliation, or lex talionis, according to which punishment meted out corresponds in degree and kind to the offense committed, expressed in the adage, "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth," also finds reflection in the Quran. However, the Quran also states that forgiveness of injury done to oneself by another is more honorable. So in chapter 2, verse 174, the Quran states, "O believers, if a person is pardoned anything by his brother, let it be done honorably, and let the payment be with kindliness. This is a concession granted you by your Lord and a mercy." End of quote. The Quranic injunction to enjoin what is good and resist what is evil has primarily a spiritual and social reformist meaning for the individual. According to this injunction, the individual's primary duty is to fight against one's inner base desires and to struggle to achieve what is good and righteous in one's community and the world. The Quran reminds the faithful, indeed, God does not change people's circumstances unless they change what is in themselves. All meaningful progress in the spiritual and social sense begins with the individual and his or her mastery over the lower ego self. In Islamic ethical literature, this internal personal campaign against the temptations and pettiness that sometimes beset us has been called the greater struggle or the greater jihad. So there you have it, a word that is almost inevitably today coupled with Islam and Muslims, and more often than not in a negative way. The Arabic word jihad means effort, struggle, striving in the broadest sense. What I just referred to is the internal and spiritual jihad. Struggling to earn a living is also a part of jihad, as is striving to get an education, fighting poverty, and instituting welfare programs. All these activities are part of jihad. Anything that is part of the basic human enterprise of bettering oneself and one's surroundings and contributing to the welfare of one's fellow human being constitutes jihad. There's also the physical military jihad, which may be required in certain circumstances. It is this last meaning, as you well know, which has become most frequently associated with the term jihad in popular discourses today. One should also be aware that jihad does not mean holy war, as is often carelessly translated in the media and even in Western academic writings. The Quran does not permit the spread of Islam by force. A holy war implies the forcible conversion of non-believers, a concept doctrinally unacceptable within Islam and clearly articulated as such in chapter 2, verse 256 of the Quran, which states, "Let there be no compulsion in religion." The first verse revealed to the Prophet, allowing him and his followers to fight in self-defense, was Quran 22:39, chapter 22, verse 39, which states, "Permission is given to those against whom fighting has been initiated because they have been wronged, and God is able to help them. These are they who have been wrongfully expelled from their homes merely for saying God is our Lord." End of quote. According to this verse, the reasons for sanctioning fighting in self-defense at this stage are primarily twofold. First, because Muslims had been physically harmed by the pagan Meccans and expelled from their homes. And second, because such persecution was visited upon the Muslims merely because of their monotheistic beliefs and not because of any wrongdoing on their part. Muslims can also come to the defense of other monotheistic believers if they are being unjustly persecuted. This is indicated clearly in the next verse in Quran 22:40, which declares, "If God had not restrained some people by means of others, monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques where God's name is mentioned frequently would have been destroyed." End of quote. The Quran thus issues an ecumenical call to action in defense of all houses of worship and to protect all human beings when wrongfully attacked by others, particularly for their religious beliefs. This verse should remind certain Muslims today who practice exclusivism in the name of Islam that our fellowship, according to the Quran itself, does not extend only to members of our own faith tradition, but to believers of diverse faith traditions who are wrongly persecuted for their beliefs. With regard to jihad in the sense of armed combat, the Quran in chapter 2, verse 190, clearly instructs the believers to fight in the way of God those who fight you, but aggress not, for God loves not the aggressors. And that's a very clear-cut, explicit command in the Quran not to initiate fighting, even under the most extreme provocation. The Quran also states in chapter 8, verse 61, "If the enemy inclines towards peace, you should also incline towards peace." End of quote. The taking of human life is such an enormity that even during a legitimate war, certain ethical restraints must be observed in the carrying out of warfare. Thus, during the military jihad, Muslim combatants are required to follow a very strict and honorable protocol of not attacking non-combatants on the opposite side. And the non-combatants are described as women, children, the elderly in general, religious functionaries such as monks and hermits who do not fight, the disabled, and the chronically ill, among others. In other words, people who traditionally do not bear arms. They may never be attacked under any condition. Muslim soldiers may also not cause reckless destruction of property or of crops and trees, nor engage in looting and arson. There are correspondences between the concept of the military jihad in Islam and that of just war in the Christian tradition. In legitimate self-defense and as a last resort, both concepts allow believers to engage in armed combat against their intractable enemies. Jihad in its basic sense thus expresses the highest striving of humans to fulfill the will of God on earth through a variety of means. Finally, the concept of getting to know one another and promoting peace. As custodians of earth, humans who are enjoined to promote what is right and prevent what is wrong are exhorted to establish peaceful, amicable relations among people of different backgrounds. This goal is a prime objective within Islamic social ethics, and the Quran seeks to promote this by encouraging people of diverse backgrounds to learn from and about one another. And this imperative is embedded in the Arabic term ta'aruf. And this concept of ta'aruf, which can be translated as knowledge of one another, derives from chapter 49, verse 13 in the Quran, which states, in translation, O humankind, we have created you from a male and a female and made you into nations and tribes, that you might get to know one another. The noblest of you in God's sight is the one who is most righteous. End of quote. In our contemporary period, the significance of Quran 49:13 lies precisely in the fact that it offers us a clear scriptural mandate for embracing the existing diversity among peoples and to respect the pluralism and beliefs that we encounter, something that we increasingly perceive the need to do so in our own time. The verse transparently exhorts Muslims to accept differences in race, ethnicity, and today we would also add national origins, and that these differences are divinely ordained, and we should therefore be only concerned with the larger common issues of morality and ethics. A related verse in chapter 5, verse 48 in the Quran further underscores this notion. For every one of you, we have appointed a law and a way of life. And if God had so willed, he could surely have made you all one single community. But he willed it otherwise in order to test you by means of what he has given you. So hasten to do good works. To God you all must return, and then he will make you truly understand all that on which you are inclined to differ. These two verses are crucial proof texts that are invoked particularly by modernist and liberal Muslims today to indicate the divine sanction of diversity in the world. Both these verses, 49:13 and 5:48, go beyond simple toleration of our diversity of backgrounds. They advocate that one should proactively get to know one another, لِتَعَارَفُوا, as inhabitants of different countries, cultures, and faith communities, so as to discover our ultimate commonalities as human beings, despite our different ways of life. Such efforts would inspire in us affection for the other and help us appreciate the diverse gifts that we bring in accordance with God's plan to one another. In conclusion, then, the foundational moral and ethical principles within the Islamic tradition that I've just discussed and that have parallels in the other great religious traditions of the world pave the way towards peaceful coexistence of all human beings. Given our troubled times, and I think we all have to agree that these are very much troubled times that we live in, given our troubled times, this is a message that needs to become better known among both Muslims and non-Muslims who live together. Thank you very much for your attention.
So Professor Afsaruddin has graciously agreed to take questions and comments. And there's three ways that you can provide such questions and comments. You can if you are here in person, James here has a microphone, and we'd ask you to ask the question into the microphone for the people that are watching the live stream. If you're on the live stream or are too shy to talk into the microphone, you can email me. My email is if you registered for the conference, is there, or it's CHRYNKOW@stmcollege.ca. So I'm hoping that someone in the audience will start us off so that James can give you the microphone. And if you're in the seminar, if you want to double your mark in the seminar, you can ask the first question.
Yes, hi. I have probably a naive question. I know words matter. In your Quran 49:13 and 5:48, it says, "All humankind, we." What is meant by we? Because we, as we know, is more than one.
Yes, definitely. So it's a common convention that's followed in the Quran. It's often called a royal we, indicating a great majestic presence and showing recognition of the exalted nature of the being who's speaking. So, of course, Muslims all agree that God is the author of the Quran. So God often refers to himself either in the first person, singular, I, but also as we. So it goes back and forth. It's a convention that's just taken for granted within the Quran. So yeah, very perceptive of you to pick up on that. And actually, almost always on the very first day of class, when we just start discussing verses from the Quran, that question comes up. It's a very good question, so don't think it's naive. Not to put you on the spot or anything.
I also, if you're in the process,
Did they come armed with their iPhones? I imagine. What's a silly question, right? Of course they did.
Thank you so much for that. I just was excited the whole way through their talk. And one of the things that I was wondering about is we often focus on the really negative reactions. And I'm just wondering, what do you know of like peace building activities that would actually show the practical side of some of the things that you've been speaking of?
So, the last part of your question again.
The practical, like any of the practical sides or any of the movements that you know of that actually enshrine these ideas.
Yeah. So, you were talking about this book that has been edited by Qamar Hudan. So I would strongly recommend that you read that book, where he is speaking as someone who's an actual practitioner, that they're translating some of these broad principles into mandate for action on the ground, right? And so they emphasize concepts like reconciliation and dialogue, sitting people down. The Quran 863, which talks about how people, if they actually start talking to one another and show recognition of one another as equal human beings who are deserving of respect and dignity, regardless of what their relationship otherwise has been, in the adversarial relationship that they've had, can work wonders, that it transforms people. Just the very act of sitting together and talking to each other like civilized human beings, sharing a meal. I think this sounds familiar. I think a lot of different traditions emphasize that, right? Sit down and have a meal and chat with one another. And you find that your preconceived notions of the other side start dissipating, or it's certainly challenged by the fact that you're sitting across from a fellow human being who feels the same way you do. So people have started, and this has been going on for a while, and have reported considerable progress in making, at least at the community level. Now, I admit it's much more challenging when we bring in states and nations, right? But at a communal level, I think interpersonal level also, these concepts have been, I think, quite remarkably successful and encouraging. Yeah, the results are actually quite promising. But there are the people who are far better qualified to answer that question in terms of actual events and actual, successes that they have recorded, and that they can give you plenty of examples. And again, these accounts can be found on the internet or, in published journals. They're journals of conflict resolution and peacemaking that are happy to publish accounts of, these actual practitioners and what they're doing in the trenches, right? Sure.
I just wanted to say, well, first of all, thank you so much for that beautiful and profound talk. But I just wanted to say, in response to that last question, that in your books on jihad, you do also provide many beautiful, very concrete, practical examples of Muslims engaging in transformative, nonviolent projects inspired by the Muslim message, from Badshah Khan, who was a contemporary of Gandhi in India, involved in the anti-colonial struggle there, and who marshaled an entire nonviolent army in that cause, to people like the Syrian philosopher Jawdat Said, who you talk about extensively. in your book. And so, in addition to the book that
Yes.
Professor Afsaruddin mentioned, her most recent book on jihad, What Everyone Needs
Yeah.
to Know, includes many of these really, really beautiful examples. And in fact, when you were talking about, when someone reviles you, you respond with good words to them.
Yeah.
It reminded me of some interpretations that I've seen of the Bible and of Jesus's mandate that when someone slaps you, you turn the other cheek. And often these examples of nonviolence are represented as being, complacent in the face of injustice. But what these interpretations from the perspective of nonviolent theory show is that they're actually extremely creative ways of making the violence of the system reveal itself through the beautiful conduct of the people who refuse to respond in kind in response to it. And so perhaps maybe you can talk a bit about the Prophet's life as an exemplar of this kind of creative, nonviolent, transformative potential.
Yeah, and these accounts often get left out of kind of the official master narratives. You're absolutely right about that. So the most prominent example that I can think of from the Prophet's life is the signing of the Treaty of Al-Hudaybiyah, which was a treaty that he signed and his followers signed with the Meccans, who until the very last minute had been truculently against the preaching of the message of Islam by Muhammad and his followers. And by the year 628 of the Common Era, the Meccans had finally tired of constant warring. And so many people had started now embracing Islam that they actually made an overture to the Prophet saying, we can draw up the terms of a treaty that will allow for the cessation of hostilities for about 10 years and would allow the Muslims to perform pilgrimage in Mecca at the Kaaba, which they had actually forbidden them to do all this time. The Prophet readily agreed, even though the terms of the treaty were very unfavorable to the Muslims. He accepted the terms because he said, at least, we are resorting to diplomatic means to usher in at least an era of peacemaking that will allow people to resume normal lives to the extent that it's possible. So that is, I think, a very dramatic example. And it's often brought up in contemporary discourse of peacemaking, how diplomacy and peacemaking were actually critical factors in the career of the Prophet himself. And therefore, we should be emulating those examples as well. So you mentioned Badshah Khan. Gandhi overshadows everybody, right? When we talk about the Indian independence movement against the British colonizers. But there was another very powerful figure by the name of Badshah Khan. And he was a Pashtun, and the British had brutally tried to pacify, as they like to call it, the Northwestern populations who had put up, rightly so, and very effective resistance against the British because they were colonizing them. After a while, the Badshah Khan got, and although he had supported this armed resistance to the occupiers, he also then came around to a certain way of thinking that said, well, maybe for the long term, we would be better off actually mounting a nonviolent resistance to the British occupation through educating our people, and eventually driving them out because the forces of history would be on their side rather than with those who are illegally occupying their lands. And he proved to be completely true. But we hardly ever hear of that narrative, right? And even though Badshah Khan developed his movement independently, oftentimes people assume that he was simply following in Gandhi's footsteps, but he actually emphasized certain Quranic concepts, the ones that I've been referencing, but also examples from the Prophet's life to show that actually this is a very authentically Islamic way of challenging oppression and tyranny, and that in the long term, it achieves its desired goals of establishing a peaceful and just social order. And Badshah Khan was absolutely right. He actually attained many of his objectives and promoted the value of education and reform from within, that Muslims had to reform themselves and their societies in order to achieve these long-lasting reforms. So yeah, these are powerful examples. I try to highlight them, as you said in my book. But you're often going against the grain, right? Because the other narrative that's always promoting as Muslims as inevitably resorting to violence because of the power of the media, they do give a lot of prominence to contemporary militant movements, right? And the average person consuming the media would not know the larger historical details and this larger tradition of peacemaking. Yeah, but it is important to point that out. Very much so.
So I really like that story of this idea of the frontier Gandhi in a region that's thought of portrayed by the media as being one of the most violent on earth.
Yeah.
And one of the things that maybe I'd ask you to comment on is there's this idea that Islam is a very ethical religion. It's virtues based, something that would be familiar, for instance, to Catholic traditions. And in this story, the idea of courage, humility, these were really important in having this creative, nonviolent moment that was taken up by a mass of people. And so maybe if you just comment on that generally, and maybe where you would see that potential for that type of thing to happen again.
So the emphasis on humility and patient forbearance and so forth, those virtues that you're talking about, and courage. Okay, the moral courage you're talking about. Okay. So one of the points I'm making in my book, one that Aziza just referred to, and its predecessor, the dense book that no one reads, and for good reason probably, is that we don't acknowledge that patience and patient forbearance is actually a very important component of jihad. Now everyone gets fixated on the hadith that does exist that divides a jihad into spiritual versus the physical jihad. And so there's, and the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. Absolutely, that hadith exists, but it's also acknowledged that it's a rather late hadith and that its reliability is not accepted by everybody. But what people forget then is that the typology is late. This kind of categorization of the two main modes of jihad does occur late, but it's drawing on Quranic vocabulary and Quranic concepts to flesh out this idea, right? So sabr, or patient forbearance, which is a really big part of the Quranic discourse. I was struck when I was first looking for the occurrence of the word sabr and its derivatives in the Quran, how much it permeates the vocabulary of the Quran and how frequently it's repeated throughout the text, and therefore how important it is as an aspect of this holistic struggle that we call jihad. That is what gets categorized as the spiritual struggle, the jihad al-nafs in Arabic, and the qital, the fighting aspect, becomes then categorized as the lesser jihad or the jihad of the sword. So these are all Quranic concepts. They're not coming in from the outside. They're not coming in out of the blue. And they're very much part and parcel of the tradition. How is that connected to courage? So the courage to stand up for the truth, this ethical imperative of promoting what is good and preventing what is wrong, means that you have to have the courage then to stand up to wrongdoing, right? You have to have the courage to resist wrongdoing. And there are many different ways of doing that. There can be the resistance with the tongue, speaking a good, there's a very famous hadith that says, speaking a word of wisdom to an unjust tyrant is one of the best expressions of jihad. It takes a lot of courage. And if you're standing up for someone who's very powerful and tyrannical and has many resources at their command to strike you down, nevertheless, you are morally obligated to uphold what is right and speak up for the truth. The weakest form of resistance, of moral resistance to wrongdoing, is to condemn it in your heart. That's a minimum that every righteous person should at least be able to recognize the difference between good and right, good and wrong, and good and evil, and right and wrong, and at least condemn it in your heart. Don't be complicit in wrongdoing, at a minimum. At a minimum, don't be complicit in any way. That's a powerful statement, right? And sometimes very hard to do. I think we do become complicit in many ways. I mean, we know that there's environmental destruction going on, but many of us will not speak up about it. Sometimes it's not politically right to do so. I know there is a certain trend within the US right now where, it becomes a highly politicized thing to make a stand for the protection of the environment. That's not the way it should be. That is the moral and right thing to do. And we have evidence of environmental degradation going on right before our very eyes. But the individual has to be morally formed. Without naming any names, there's certain politicians who've gotten education in some of the best elite schools in the US, but they have failed in their moral duty towards the people that they represent. The question has come up. Did they never get any kind of a moral formation and education? Do they not realize that what they're doing is intrinsically wrong, right? So sometimes that's lamentably lacking in our public officials, but I think this is where citizens have to rise up to the occasion and make that case and exhibit, great moral and spiritual courage and the marshal the ethical resources to mount this kind of resistance to, I think, pervasive wrongdoing around us.
And on that note, if I may ask a question,
Sure.
Speaking of the communal dimension of resistance, one of the things that stifles ethical thought is a sense of individualism, which we've inherited from our capitalist social structures and all of those things. What are some ways of conceptualizing community and communal resistance that are able to combat this notion of individualism? And on a separate note, I liked how you put the imperative to make accessible cities, clean up your cities. I wish we had a Muslim form of city planning.
Or neighborhood planning. Remember to keep the pathways of your apartment building clear and accessible. Yeah. Education. I think we are, again, lamentably failing in the goals of our education. It really should start when we are young, right? When we are children. We should teach our children to play companionably with other children, foster a sense of community. I think a very strong sense of that community came back with a vengeance during the pandemic. I know lots of people, and I should say including myself, suddenly realized that family matters, your community matters, right? When you have to combat such a thing in your lives, you don't do it alone. You realize that you need everyone at the helm, right? Everyone you know, however you define your community. That's absolutely vital. We need to revive this sense of community, but we need to broaden our idea of community as well. It's not just our neighborhood anymore, right? It's the world. I mean, we do have to cultivate that sense of global belonging, that what we do here matters, what happens in, far-flung areas as we perceive them to be, and what happens there. And notice, we just went through a global pandemic. What happens in one little city, what a bat decides to do, it suddenly has huge global consequences, right? So we're not in a hermetically sealed world at all. So we also, I think, have to revise our sense of community, that we are obligated to everyone we know personally, but also people we've never met, because our lives are intertwined, our goals are intertwined, and we are all in this together. I know it sounds like almost a, just a pious throwaway remark, but increasingly I think we can see that that's just an accurate description of the world that we have inherited and that we will continue to inhabit for the foreseeable future. So yeah, again, the whole notion of the environmental degradation should drive home this point very, very strongly to us, that it does matter what we do, whether we recycle our bags and, someone in somewhere in a remote corner of Asia is paying the price. Why are they paying the price for what we're doing to pollute the environment? I mean, the US and the Western industrialized countries in general, all the industrial countries, including, of course, China and Japan as well, we're the ones polluting the environment. We're not necessarily paying the biggest price, right? Yeah. So I think we need to think far more globally in a highly morally responsible manner.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite my co-director, Gertrude Rempré, of the Irene and Doug Schmeiser Center for Faith, Reason, Peace, and Justice to thank you and to tell you folks about how you can participate more tomorrow and hear more of Professor Afsaruddin and Aziza Kanji, who asked that excellent question as well.
Thank you so much. I am truly honored to have this opportunity to thank Dr. Afsaruddin for her presentation this evening. I think yesterday it was my colleague Chris was interviewed by local media, and the question was, why would a Catholic college be hosting a conference called Islam, Peace, and Justice? What's our justification? And there are a lot of good answers to that question, but I think one of the main answers is because we're kin. And that's what I heard in your presentation this evening. The kinship that exists between our traditions, the Abrahamic faiths that share so much in terms of a vision for humanity. And what you were able to do for us this evening, I think, was, at least for me, was this sense of painting a vision of peace that is kind of set against an infinite horizon. And that horizon is fed by the revelation of the Quran, the revelation of our various traditions, but that really calls us to that moral and ethical imperative, to practical engagement with peace, to being able to imagine the power of that positive peace building, that not responding in kind, and how that can transform the playing field altogether. So in these troubled times, you have given us a message of hope, and I'm incredibly grateful for that message that you have offered to us today. So please join me once again in thanking our presenter this evening. I'd like to also take the opportunity to once again thank the partners in bringing together this Islam, Peace, and Justice Conference. We have been working with the Islamic Association of Saskatchewan, the Saskatoon Peace Coalition, the Department of Religion and Culture here at STM, and of course with the supporters and the benefactors connected to the Irene and Doug Schmeiser Center for Faith, Reason, Peace, and Justice. So again, thank you so much for all of the support that we've received in the wider community. Thanks to those who participated this evening. We have those of you who are here in person, and it's lovely to begin to do that again and to start feeling like we are an embodied community. But that's not to disregard our friends that are coming to us through YouTube. And we'd like to certainly acknowledge your presence and your participation from wherever you may be this evening. And thank you for your support of our work here. So Chris did ask me to announce for tomorrow. So those of you who are registered in the conference will know that we have 2 more panel presentations tomorrow that will happen through your Zoom link that you will have received in your email for those of you who are registered. And then tomorrow, late afternoon at 5 o'clock, we will have our second keynote. We will hear from Aziza Kanji. Looking forward to that. Second keynote followed by a synthesis panel trying to pull all this together. And then, of course, an invitation to some prayer time as well. So thanks again. Have a wonderful rest of your evening and take good care on your journeys home. Good night.